Okay, turn to Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 10. Proverbs 1 and verse 10. It says, "My son, if sinners entice thee, consent thou not." We're going to look at hopefully verses 10, 11, and 12 tonight, Lord willing. So in the first 9 verses of Proverbs chapter 1, Solomon exhorted his son of the benefits and necessity of getting wisdom, and we've talked about all that. And now he opens up with verse 10 through 19 with a warning of potential danger that could lie ahead. And this is especially important for a son that would be in the teenage years, I would say, maybe early 20s. I don't know how old his son was, but these warnings would be especially pertinent to somebody at that age for reasons we will look at here tonight. So children have a problem when they're born into this world, and that is that they're born with a sin nature. They're born depraved, and so that they're already starting off on the wrong foot, as it were. And we read about that in Psalm 58 and verse 3, which says that the wicked go astray as soon as they be born, speaking lies. And then in Genesis 8 and verse 21, I guess I didn't wait for you to get there, but I didn't get there either, so don't worry about it. Genesis 8 and verse 21, this is what the Lord said himself about man's heart and the condition of young people. It says, "And the Lord smelled a sweet savor, and the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done." So our hearts, and this goes for all of us in our natural state, the imagination of our hearts are evil. Right? So that goes for little kids, teenagers, adults, everybody. And if that's not bad enough, then so we have an evil heart, an evil propensity within us, and we can dream up all kinds of bad things to do on our own. But then if that's not bad enough, we have friends that will entice us to do the wrong thing. So even if we're not feeling particularly evil on one day, then maybe one of our buddies are, and then he can stir us up to do it. And that's what Solomon is warning about here. He says, "When sinners entice thee, consent thou not." To entice is to stir up, incite, instigate to a course of action, also to provoke to anger. So whenever Solomon is warning about enticement, he's warning about instigation, when somebody is trying to get you to do something that you shouldn't do. And my experience with children has taught me that there are generally 3 types. And I'm going to elaborate on something. I know I mentioned this a while back. I don't remember exactly when it was. It kind of dawned on me at that time. It might have been in the school bus sermon. I can't remember. But then I've refined some of my thoughts on this and sort of made it into a full-fledged philosophy here. So 3 different types of kids. First of all, you have the instigators. Okay? This is usually the smallest group, thankfully. So you got them. And there are usually at least one or more of these kids in every group, typically. If you have a group of kids and they're misbehaving, chances are you have at least one instigator there. These are the troublemakers, right? They're the ones that rile things up. Now let me ask you, who here, when you were young, was an instigator? Anybody? Anybody?
Looking at me.
Yeah.
We was all looking on single.
Yeah. Okay, so Austin was an instigator, apparently. He doesn't want to admit it, but my wife says that she thinks that I was too. And I was trying to think back on this, and I was probably half instigator, half instigated, I think. It just because I was thinking about my own experience on the school bus, and maybe this is just poetic justice that I now drive one, because I got into plenty of trouble on the school bus, and it probably wasn't always somebody else's fault. So I could probably have fallen into that group when I was younger. The instigators aren't necessarily bad kids, although some of them are. And when I say bad kids, I mean like rebellious, bad attitudes, just not kids that just get themselves, they just can't kind of control themselves and they do silly, stupid things and get yelled at. But I mean bad kids. And there, there's some of them out there, unfortunately. And I wasn't one of those kids, but these kind of kids, the instigators, they need constant supervision and restraint, because if they are left to themselves, they'll bring their mother to shame. They can't control themselves, so they need somebody watching out for them all the time. They instigate other children. These other ones are called the instigated. This is the second group. We'll get to them in a second. And the instigated would normally behave themselves if they weren't incited to foolishness by the instigators. And I see this on the bus all the time. There are kids that if you take the instigator away, they're just fine. And they sit there and they behave themselves fine. But if there is an instigator, then they are very easily incited to foolishness. It's kind of funny. I've got one of these. There's one boy on the bus. When the bus is dead quiet until he gets on. And then it's not bad, but then there's chatter and talk and this and that whenever he gets on. In the morning, it's pitch dark out and everybody else is sleeping. As soon as he gets on, then the bus livens up. And then as soon as he gets off in the afternoon, it goes quiet again. But while he's on the bus, things are always interesting. He's an instigator. He's not a bad kid. He's just an instigator that needs constant attention. That's why he's sitting up in the front seat right next to me. To maintain order, then the instigators must be identified and publicly reprimanded and punished if necessary, so that the instigators and the instigated will see and fear. You look in 1 Timothy 5 and verse 20. 1 Timothy 5 and verse 20. This is what needs to happen to these people that Solomon's warning about. If sinners entice thee, these sinners need to be reprimanded and punished publicly so that they won't be able to easily incite and tempt other people. 1 Timothy 5 and verse 20, Paul says, them that sin rebuke before all, that others also may fear. And Solomon had something to say about this too in Proverbs 19 and verse 25. Proverbs 19 and verse 25. He said, smite a scorner, and the simple will beware, and reprove one that hath understanding, and he will understand knowledge. And I've seen this happen on the bus before, whenever I've had to reprimand somebody, and then for a while everybody else behaves, and they take note of that. Proverbs 21 and verse 11, when the scorner is punished, the simple is made wise. He says, oh, I don't want that to happen to me. And when the wise is instructed, he receiveth knowledge. But these children, the instigators, they make managing children a challenge. And I'm sure everybody's had experience with this, either with your own or you've seen others like that. And chances are, if you have several kids, probably one of them is going to be an instigator. They're the ones that stir up the other ones. And I used to get, my brother and I, we would get in trouble because I would instigate my brother, and then he would cry or retaliate or whatever, and then he would make a fuss, and then we would both get yelled at. And it was kind of a team effort there. Then the second group are the instigated. And there are usually, I'd say, between a handful to a small majority of children in every group. So you can't really tell who the instigated are until there's an instigator around. And then the instigated start to, come up out of the ranks. If the instigators are not reined in early, the ranks of the instigated will grow. And the more timid children, who I would call the potentially instigateds, they are emboldened to join in the folly. So you have instigated and then potentially instigated. So you get the ones that will really easily join in. As soon as somebody else starts, they jump right in. Then you get the other ones that it takes a while, but then they kind of see, well, nobody else is getting yelled at, and then they start. How many of you were the instigateds? Oh, Judy, you were just such a perfect angel.
I was awfully good.
Can we tell you some stories?
Well, there's only 3, so I guess all of you are the good kids then. I guess nobody's going to even fess up to being an instigated. Okay.
We know.
Yeah. You guys have the dirt on at least 3 of them here. So, the instigated children behave well in the absence of an instigator. Troublemaking doesn't come naturally to them. See, some of them, the instigators, it's just in their DNA. They're just born to cause trouble. The other ones, they have to be, helped out a little bit with that. If they or one of their fellows are punished, then they quickly calm down and then they remain that way for a while. I've seen this before. Then the third group I would call the unaffected. And there's usually between a handful to a large minority of these children in every group. The unaffected are unaffected by the actions of the instigators or the instigated. So how many of you would be the unaffected? Oh, Austin, you're an unaffected, huh? Yeah. You're unaffected? Okay, and I'm sure you've all been known to lie, too, but... Okay, so anyway, no, I'm just kidding. I'm glad we're such well-behaved children. The unaffected will sit quietly and mind their own business, no matter how much chaos is going on around them. And I've got some kids like this on the bus. It doesn't matter if they had a whole bus full of just horrible kids, they would just sit there and look straight ahead and listen to their music, and they would never join in. Doesn't matter how crazy things get. There are a few of them out there, and they're the easy ones. These children, of course, make managing children a breeze. Now, the instigated, out of these three groups, the instigated children and young adults they are the ones that particularly need to heed the warning of Proverbs 1:10. My son, if sinners entice thee, consent thou not. Because the ones that are doing the enticing are the instigators. And the unaffected, they don't really have to worry about it because they're just not enticed. They don't go with the crowd. They just don't care. They just kind of, pay no attention to all that stuff. But the instigated are the ones that are in danger here. It would be easy if we could just raise children on an uninhabited island, and then you wouldn't have to worry about a lot of these things, but that's not the world that we live in, so this is why Solomon gives us his warning. This is basically a warning against peer pressure, and peer pressure is a powerful influence for children and adults alike, for that matter. That's why God warned Israel, not kids, but adults, in Exodus 23 and verse 2. Exodus 23:2, that we're not supposed to follow a multitude to do evil. Exodus 23:2, thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. Think about this in context. I just thought about this. Whenever the Pharisees brought up Jesus Christ to Pilate and they wanted to have him executed, and they were saying if he weren't a malefactor he wouldn't be here, and they stirred up the people. They basically incited the people to violence. And these people were following a multitude to do evil, and a lot of them were probably just caught up in the euphoria of it all. And what they did was, in the second half of that verse, neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. They were crying out, crucify him, trying to wrest judgment. He is an innocent man, and they were complicit in his execution. This is what the Lord was warning against here. My son, if sinners entice thee, consent thou not. King Saul fell into this peer pressure whenever he listened to the people instead of God. If you look in 1 Samuel 15, in verse 3, the Lord told Saul, the Lord told Saul that he was supposed to utterly destroy the Amalekites. 1 Samuel 15:3, the Lord says, now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not, but slay both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. So the Lord's instruction here was very clear, right? Everybody has to die. Women, kids, ox, sheep, all the animals, everybody, the king, the whole kit and caboodle. But Saul didn't exactly do that. Verse 9, but Saul and the people spared Agag, that was the king, and the best of the sheep, and of the oxen, and of the fatlings, and the lambs, and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. But everything that was vile and refuse, they destroyed utterly. And then verse 20, here we see what happened, and that was that the people gave Saul this idea to, well, spare the good of the flock, and we can sacrifice them to the Lord, right? And there's some plausibility to that idea if you're not going to obey God. Verse 20, and Saul said unto Samuel, because Samuel wants to know what's going on here. Why do I hear these sheep bleating in the background when you said you've done the will of the Lord? And Saul said unto Samuel, yea, I have obeyed the voice of the Lord, and have gone the way which the Lord sent me, and have brought Agag the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites. But the people took of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the chief of the things which should have been utterly destroyed, to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God in Gilgal. So it was the people he blames it on. And you know what? The buck stops with the king, right? Even if the people did talk him into it, that's no excuse, right? You can't, I mean, if tomorrow everybody decides that we're going to bring a piano into church from now on, and then I go before the Lord and just say, well, that's what everybody wanted and democracy rules, guess what? I'm going to be the one that's going to answer for that, because I would have the ultimate say-so when it would come to something like that in the house of God as the overseer. So you can't ever blame decisions on subordinates, right? You have to take responsibility for those decisions ourselves. Men have a tendency to adopt herd mentality and follow the crowd even when they have no idea where it's headed. And this is what Solomon's talking about. My son, if sinners entice thee, consent thou not. If you're ever going to follow a crowd, literally or figuratively, you better know what's going on. You better really know what that crowd's about. And chances are following a crowd to do anything going anywhere is a bad idea. I would say you'd really want to consider that before you ever follow a crowd, because chances are, what does the Bible say? Broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, straight is the gate, narrow is the way that leadeth unto life. Many there be that go in thereat on the broad way that leads to destruction. So you really want to be careful about following a crowd. This happened to the 200 men who followed Absalom in his rebellion against David. Look at 2 Samuel 15 and verse 11. I was going to say these men should have listened to Solomon's instruction, but Solomon wasn't born yet. He might have been born. He was probably born, but he wasn't the king yet. He hadn't penned these Proverbs yet. He would have probably still been a young man, because he would have been the half-brother of Absalom. 2 Samuel 15:11. I don't know if he was born yet or not. I'd have to look back and get the chronology if this was after David's deal with Bathsheba or not. 2 Samuel 15:11. It said, And with Absalom went 200 men out of Jerusalem that were called, and they went in their simplicity, and they knew not anything. They were just following a charismatic leader, because that's what Absalom was. You remember, Absalom stood at the gate, and when anybody would go in, they were going to go to the king to get a judgment, and Absalom would stand there and lament and just say, oh, if I were the king of Israel, I would hear the cause of the poor and the oppressed. And he stole the hearts, it was said. He stole the hearts of the men of Israel. So these guys were following him, not knowing anything. Didn't know where they were going. They were just following some charismatic leader. And then this type of groupthink, as it's sometimes called, was also responsible for this uprising in Ephesus that was led by a guy named Demetrius, who was a silversmith. And this is a great example of, look at Acts 19. Acts 19. This is a great example of whenever there's some kind of a popular movement going on, how there's usually a presented reason and a real reason. And we'll get to that in just a second. In Acts chapter 19 and verse 23, it says, And the same time there arose no small stir about that way. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, which made silver shrines for Diana, that was the goddess of the Ephesians, made silver shrines for Diana, brought no small gain unto the craftsmen, whom he called together with the workmen of like occupation, and said, Sirs, ye know that by this craft we have our wealth. So they're making all their money off of making these shrines for the goddess Diana. Moreover, ye see and hear that not alone at Ephesus, but also throughout all Asia, this Paul hath persuaded and turned away much people, saying that they be no gods which are made with hands. Think about the argument here. This guy is saying that people that fashion a god with their own hands, that these actually aren't gods. And I mean, is this like self-evident truth or what here that he thinks he's going to bamboozle people with? So that not only this our craft is in danger to be set at naught, but also, this is more important, our livelihood, that's important, but what's really important here, but also that the temple of the great goddess Diana should be despised, and her magnificence should be destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worshipeth. You see, they gotta make noble intentions here. It's not really so much it's going to hit our pocketbook, but it's more about the gods. It's always about the children. Well, it's about the gods. We can't have the gods being maligned here. And when they heard these sayings, they were full of wrath, and cried out, saying, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. And the whole city was filled with confusion. And having caught Gaius and Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed with one accord into the theater. And when Paul would have entered in unto the people, the disciples suffered him not. And certain of the chief of Asia, which were his friends, sent unto him, desiring that he would not adventure himself into the theater. Some therefore cried one thing, and some another, for the assembly was confused, and the more part knew not wherefore they were come together. So here these guys are, they just see a big group of people, rushing into the theater, and they're all crying out, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians," and they just join right in with it. And they don't even know why they're there. They don't know what's going on. And they certainly don't know that it's just some guy that's worried about losing his job, basically, and he's using a pretense of religion to try to rile the troops up. They don't have any idea what's going on here. So we always want to be really careful about this. And I would say that patriots ought to be especially careful about this, because there's usually a presented reason for a political uprising, and then there's the real reason for a political uprising. And this is very applicable to what Solomon's saying here. "My son, when sinners entice thee, consent thou not." When somebody says, "Hey, come with us to this rally, come with us to this march or this whatever, this demonstration," you want to be careful about that. Now, I've gone to rallies. I've gone to Ron Paul rallies and things like that. And I'm not saying you can never go to a political rally, but especially if it's one of these things where like a protest, and in this environment when protests tend to get violent and people are getting beat up and stuff is getting broken and things, you want to be really, really careful about that. I would say, this is just my observation, that demonstrations are rarely organic and spontaneous. I don't think that it's just, Joe Blow happens to be talking to John Smith and he says, I don't like the way that things are going now. And he's like, I was thinking of the same thing. And then, Rodney hears him off in the background and says, yeah, I agree with that too. And then, before you know it, you get a whole group of people and they're down in Washington or the state capitol or wherever. That's generally not how these things happen, I don't think. There's usually powerful interests behind them and paid provocateurs. And this has been shown at Ferguson, out here on the other side of the state in St. Louis. Remember the thing there that happened when the kid got killed by the cop and there was all these riots? There were paid provocateurs there, and they had a video of this guy. And I mean, if the video was, unless my eyes were deceiving me, this was a guy they had another video of him teaching a class on basically being a provocateur and going about and demonstrating and stuff. And here this guy was, supposedly just some Joe Blow on the street, and it was the same exact guy. And they were inciting riots and that kind of thing. So you want to be really careful about that kind of stuff. Think about Black Lives Matter, Antifa, the Trump protests. I'm not a fan of Trump, but the Trump protesters, a lot of those, most of them, that's not an organic protest. Those are paid protesters that are there, and they start violence. Yeah.
How are you using the word organic? I don't understand that.
Or where it just came about naturally, basically.
Okay.
Not something that was fabricated or planned out and caused. I mean, just something that just kind of spontaneously happened. Or these student protests against gun rights. Whenever they had, I think it was the shooting in Florida. They had right after that. They had these student protests, and this little girl was up there giving this speech, and all these students just miraculously just somehow all decided that they were all going to have these walkouts on the same day from all of their schools all over the country. I don't believe for 1 second that was just a spontaneous thing that some students organized. Not for 1 second, I don't believe that. I'm sure that people in high places somewhere had orchestrated that whole thing. They might have orchestrated the shooting, if there even was a shooting. Half these shootings, I don't think they even happened. But anyway, that's another story for another time. But anyway, just be really careful when sinners are enticing you to follow them, is what I'm trying to get at. You never want to forget Solomon's warning. Proverbs 16:29, you don't need to turn there. It says, a violent man enticeth his neighbor and leadeth him into the way that is not good. You always want to remember that. Now Solomon's warning here in Proverbs 1:10, if sinners entice thee, consent thou not. This should teach us another valuable lesson, and that is that we don't have to, nor should we, consent to enticement. Right? If sinners entice thee, consent thou not. So it's just probably the most basic lesson in here is that we do not have to consent to enticement. Right? We do have a choice. It's not like if you're enticed by your own flesh, by the devil, by your friends, by peers or teachers or whatever, you don't have to consent, right? You can say no. It's not easy to say no, and you don't like to be the odd man out and look like the weirdo and all that, but you don't have to go along with it. To consent means to agree together. To agree together or with another in opinion or statement. So whenever you're out there, especially in school, but in other places, and everybody, of course, believes in evolution. or everybody believes in gay rights, or everybody believes in whatever the latest thing is, you don't have to agree to that. You can say, I don't agree with that, and I don't care what you think. It doesn't matter to me. To be of the same mind. It's to agree to a proposal or request, etc. This would be like a separate primary definition. Voluntarily to accede to or acquiesce in what another proposes or desires, to agree, comply, or yield. When sinners entice thee, consent thou not. Don't agree to it. Don't yield to it. You don't have to go along with them. And it doesn't matter if they want to make fun of you or call you names, or people are talking bad about you behind your back at work or something like that. I think you're some kind of a weirdo. It doesn't matter. Don't consent to it. It says in James 1 and verse 14 that every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lusts and enticed. Right? This is how sin happens. We're drawn away, we're tempted, and then drawn away by our lust and enticed. So the thing is, we have within us the spirit that dwells in us, lusteth to envy, right? So it is easy to get us to be enticed because we want to do the wrong thing in our flesh, right? Our spirit doesn't want to, our flesh wants to. So whenever you have a flesh in you that wants to do the wrong thing, when somebody suggests it, then it's easier that some barriers are broken down there. But enticement is not itself sin, and it's also not irresistible. So the enticement's not a sin, right? To be tempted to do something is not a sin, because remember, Jesus was tempted in all points as we are, yet without sin. So we can be tempted, but not sin. You could have a temptation to pull up the internet and go look at pornography. That temptation right there is not a sin. But if you do it, it's a sin. If you start thinking about it, and you're thinking about it in your mind or something, and you're basically watching pornography in your head, that's a sin. But to be tempted to it and just say, no way, I'm not going there, you haven't sinned, right? You're only sinned whenever you give in to the temptation. Lust and incitement consented to then brings forth sin and death. James 1 and verse 15. It says, then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. And this is exactly what's going to happen to these guys there in Proverbs chapter 1. And we'll get to that here probably in a couple of weeks or so. In verse 18, when it said that they lay wait for their own blood, they lurk privily for their own lives, there in verse 18. So that's just a little bit of a spoiler alert, that these men that entice people to do evil, especially evil like let us lay wait for blood and things like that, they're going to get what's coming to them. The Lord is going to pay that back. So they're going to be the ones that end up in sin and death. Now, to prevent this, we do what it says in Ephesians 5:11. You don't have to turn there, but it says, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness. In other words, consent not, but rather reprove them. So whenever an ungodly person tries to convince us to do something or talk us into it, instead of having fellowship with it, we reprove it. We say, no, I'm not doing that. That's wrong. That's sinful. That's wicked. I'm not agreeing to that. I'm not believing that. I'm not going to say that or whatever. That's what you do. Reprove it. Don't have fellowship with it. It says in Proverbs 13:20 that that he that walketh with wise men shall be wise, but a companion of fools shall be destroyed. So we want to heed the words of Solomon, and James agrees there in verse 16, James 1:16, do not err, my beloved brethren. So we want to be aware that if we are tempted and then we're enticed and then we give into that, it's sin and then it's death. But we don't want to err, which means to veer off the path. My son, if sinners entice thee, consent thou not.